On an ordinary morning in Minneapolis, the sound of children's laughter filled the halls of Annunciation Catholic School. It was supposed to be a safe place, a sanctuary of learning and prayer. But within minutes, that peace shattered into screams, chaos, and gunfire. A 9-year-old child later described it in the simplest, most haunting words. "I heard shots. I didn't know where to run." And in the middle of the devastation, as parents, teachers, and children scrambled for cover, a little girl, bleeding and terrified, looked up at a stranger and begged, "Please, just hold my hand." This is the story of a Minneapolis school shooting, a tragedy that ripped through a community, shocked a nation, and left behind questions that may never truly be answered. The morning of August 27th began like any other. Students gathered for Mass inside the church. Teachers guided them into their pews. Parents, some elderly parishioners, and staff filled the wooden benches beneath the stained glass windows. For many, it was a weekly ritual. Then, without warning, the glass shattered. A sharp crack echoed across the chapel. Some thought it was construction noise. Others thought a window had broken by accident. But those who had lived long enough to recognize danger knew instantly this was gunfire. Bullets tore through the windows. The choir of voices singing hymns turned into a chorus of screams. Children ducked beneath the pews. Teachers tried to shield their students with their own bodies. In the chaos, 116 rounds would be fired before the nightmare ended. Within minutes, 2 children were dead, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. 17 more people lay injured. Children as young as 6, teenagers up to 15, and 3 adults in their 80s. The church, a place of worship, had become a war zone. Among the survivors was a man named Patrick Scollin. He had rushed toward the gunfire when most people ran away. And in that moment, he heard the faint voice of a little girl who had been struck in the head. Through tears, she whispered, "Please, just hold my hand." Patrick did. He stayed with her until help arrived. It was an image that would haunt him forever, but it was also a symbol of the fragile humanity left standing in the middle of the terror. The shooter, 23-year-old Westman, was found dead at the scene, having taken his own life. But for the survivors, that ending brought no relief. For them, the trauma had only just begun. As police stormed the building and parents scrambled to find their children, the scene outside the church was pure chaos. Mothers screamed names into crowd, desperate to see their sons and daughters alive. Fathers demanded answers from officers who could only tell them to wait. One 9-year-old later told reporters that the sound of the shots will never leave their mind. "I thought it was fireworks," they said, but then everyone was crying. Everyone was running. Imagine being that age, old enough to recognize fear, but too young to understand why anyone would want to hurt you. At first, police and media scrambled to piece together what had happened. But soon, the horrifying picture began to emerge. The shooter had not chosen the school at random. This place had a connection, and that revelation would only deepen the horror. But before we go deeper into this tragic story, take a moment to subscribe if you're new here. These are the stories that need to be told, and by supporting this channel, you help keep the memory of the victims alive. Now, let's go back, because to understand the attack, we need to understand the man behind it. Who was Westman, and why did he return to the very school he once attended, armed with hatred and enough ammunition to massacre dozens? The answers lie in his past, and in the disturbing writings he left behind. Westman was not an outsider to Annunciation Catholic School. He had once walked its halls as a student. His mother had worked at the church until 2021. For years, his family had ties to the parish, and yet this was the very place he chose to destroy. Those who knew him from childhood described a quiet, withdrawn boy. He wasn't the type to lash out in school or cause big trouble, but he was also not the kind of kid who made many friends. Teachers remembered him as average. Neighbors remembered him as shy. But beneath the surface, something was already beginning to fracture. In his late teens and early 20s, Westman grew isolated. Friends drifted away. Family ties grew strained, and he began spending long hours online. That's where his darkness deepened. Investigators later uncovered a disturbing manifesto. Dozens of handwritten pages. In them, He expressed hatred for Catholics, Jews, and what he called the filthy world. He referenced past mass shooters, calling them inspirations. He spoke of wanting notoriety, of wanting his name remembered. He carved swastikas, hateful phrases, and chilling slogans onto his weapons. Phrases like Mashallah and Kill Trump appear alongside Nazi symbols and the names of previous killers. It was a chaotic storm of ideology, extremism, and madness. But as investigators sifted through his writings and his online activity, they began to notice something unusual. His rants did not form a clear ideology. He contradicted himself often, borrowing fragments from hate groups, political rhetoric, and conspiracy theories, but never holding on to a single belief. One expert later said it appeared less like a calculated political motive and more like a desperate man trying to find meaning in his own sickness. And yet, the results were the same. Dozens of lives destroyed. On the day of the shooting, Westman arrived heavily armed. He carried a rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol. He brought with him 116 rounds of ammunition. Authorities believe he planned a mass slaughter. Had his weapons not jammed at one point, the death toll could have been far higher. The FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement swarmed the scene within minutes. Streets were blocked off. Parents and bystanders watched as armored vehicles and tactical teams pushed inside the church. When officers finally found Westman, he was already dead by suicide. But what he left behind, his manifesto, his videos, his weapons, painted a chilling portrait. In one video, he filmed himself loading his weapons. On the side of the rifle, words were scratched into the metal, Judgment Day. He looked into the camera and smiled briefly before turning it off. Why? Why would someone who grew up in that very community, whose own family had ties to the church, come back to unleash such horror? Investigators believe the roots of his hatred lay in rejection, isolation, and untreated mental illness. His writings revealed jealousy, paranoia, and bitterness toward people who seemed happy. He wanted to hurt the innocent, not because of who they were, but because of what he felt he was not. That conclusion gave no comfort to the grieving families. For them, explanations didn't matter. Nothing could explain why 2 children would never come home again. Nothing could erase the scars of the 17 others who were wounded. Outside the school, a memorial began to grow. Flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes. Strangers wept as they dropped off candles. A community struggled to process the unthinkable. Meanwhile, the nation reacted. President Trump ordered flags across the country to be flown at half-staff until the end of the month. Politicians on both sides called it an act of terrorism and a hate crime. Across Minnesota, schools and churches ramped up security. Some even brought in armed guards. Parents had to face impossible questions from their children. Questions like, why did he do this, and will he come back? For many families, bedtime became a ritual of reassurance, a repeated promise that they were safe now, even though deep down, no one truly believed it. The story of Annunciation Catholic School spread quickly across the country. News outlets broadcast the haunting testimony of survivors. The world heard about the little girl who whispered to Patrick Scullin, begging him just to hold her hand as she lay bleeding. That single sentence captured the innocence of a child in the face of unimaginable horror. And yet, as horrifying as the tragedy was, it also revealed moments of bravery. Teachers who shielded their students. Parishioners who risked their own lives to pull others to safety. First responders who stormed into the line of fire, not knowing what awaited them inside. These small acts of courage stood in stark contrast to the shooter's cruelty. In the days that followed, questions about prevention rose louder. Could someone like Westman have been stopped? Were there warning signs? Some pointed to his disturbing online presence. He had posted strange and hateful messages months before the shooting. Others said his family and friends had seen him withdraw, becoming more erratic. But no one ever believed he would do something like this. That is the haunting truth of so many tragedies like this. The signs are often visible only in hindsight. The FBI has since classified the shooting as both an act of domestic terrorism and a hate crime. But those labels do little to ease the pain. For survivors, the memories remain raw. Children still wake up screaming from nightmares. Teachers still freeze at the sound of a slamming door or a loud bang. Parents still drop their kids off at school with a fear they never felt before. And for the two families who buried their children that week, life will never, ever be the same. Take a moment here to reflect. Imagine what it feels like to lose someone so young, so suddenly, in a place where they were supposed to be safe. It's hard to even comprehend. If you want to see more of these stories told with honesty and compassion, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Your support ensures these stories and the lessons they carry are never forgotten. But the story doesn't end there. Because even after the funerals, even after the news trucks left, the people of Minneapolis were left with something far more difficult to face. How do you heal from something like this? That's where we go next. The funerals came quickly. 2 small coffins, carried into churches filled with hundreds of mourners. Classmates who should have been playing in the schoolyard stood, instead in black clothing, holding flowers. Parents wept openly in the pews. Teachers held each other's hands for strength. The city of Minneapolis stopped that week. Flags at half-staff waved in the wind. At night, candles flickered outside Annunciation Catholic School, illuminating the faces of strangers who had gathered in silence. But while the community grieved, the difficult questions lingered. How could this happen here? How do you ever send your child back to school after something like this? For many families, healing became a daily battle. Survivors spoke about the nightmares. Some children refused to step foot back into church. Others struggled to sleep through the night, haunted by the sounds of shattered glass and screams. Parents described clinging to their children, unwilling to let them out of sight. A routine school day now carried the weight of fear. Drop-offs at the classroom door became emotional goodbyes. Every text, every call from the school office triggered a rush of panic. The teachers carried their own scars. Some admitted they could not stop replaying the scene in their minds. The moment they dove on top of their students, the sound of bullets ripping into the wood around them, the cries of terrified children. Even months later, some teachers still flinched at loud noises. And then there were the elderly parishioners, 3 of whom had been injured that day, survivors in their 80s, who had lived through wars, recessions, and decades of change. Yet even they admitted they had never experienced fear quite like that. The city came together in remarkable ways. Fundraisers supported the victims' families. Therapy sessions were offered free to survivors and their loved ones. Churches from across the state sent messages of solidarity. Students from other schools wrote letters of encouragement, telling the children of Annunciation that they were not alone. And yet, beneath all of that compassion, another reality sat heavy. The truth that this was not the first school shooting in America. And tragically, it would not be the last. Experts debated what could be done. More security? More awareness of mental health? Stricter gun laws? The arguments played out on television and social media. But for the people of Minneapolis, these debates felt distant. They weren't dealing with policy. They were dealing with trauma. Still, some lessons were clear. The shooter had left behind writings that showed his obsessions. He had posted disturbing content online. His weapons were carved with symbols of hate. In hindsight, there were warning signs. The tragedy lay in the fact that no one realized how serious they were until it was too late. And that raises a chilling question. How many others are out there, silently planning, quietly unraveling, unnoticed until they strike? For the survivors, the healing process continues. Some children have returned to school, determined not to let fear win. Others are still receiving therapy. Some families have spoken publicly, demanding action. Others have chosen silence, mourning privately. But no matter how each person copes, the memory of that day will never fade. There's a memory of a little boy who whispered to his teacher, "Am I going to die?" as bullets struck the walls around them. There's the image of parents sprinting toward the school, desperate to find their children alive. There's a haunting plea of a wounded girl begging a stranger, "Please, just hold my hand." These moments tell the story of Minneapolis more powerfully than any headline ever could. And while the shooter hoped to be remembered, the community has made a promise. It will not be his name that is carried forward, but the names of the children whose lives were stolen. Their memory, their innocence, their stories. That is what must remain. If you've made it this far, take a moment to honor the victims in your own way. Light a candle, say a prayer, or Simply pause and reflect. Their lives were far too short, but their impact will never be forgotten. And if you believe these stories must continue to be told, stories that shine light in the darkest corners of tragedy, then join us. Subscribe, share, and help keep these voices alive. Together, we can make sure the world never looks away. This is a story of the Minneapolis school shooting, a day of horror, a story of loss, and in the middle of all that darkness, a reminder of the power of simple human connection.